If your tomatoes are growing plenty of leaves but very few fruits right now, there's a good chance you're making one of the June mistakes that quietly cuts your harvest in half. The hard part is that most gardeners don't even realize it's happening until July or August, when the plants look big, but the baskets stay empty. I see it every year. Good people work hard in the garden. They water, they feed, they pull weeds, they spend money on products they were told would help. Then harvest season arrives and they wonder why their neighbor with fewer plants somehow ends up picking twice as many tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers. The truth is that early June is one of the most important moments of the entire growing season. What you do right now can decide whether your plants spend the summer producing fruit or simply growing leaves. And some of the most common mistakes look completely harmless at first. One of them actually makes plants appear healthier for a few weeks before the problems begin. Another mistake encourages disease without showing any warning signs until it is already spreading through the garden. And one mistake almost guarantees that cucumber production slows down much earlier than it should. I learned many of these lessons the hard way over the years. Back when I was younger, I thought success came from doing more. More fertilizer, more water, more attention. But gardening has a way of humbling you. Some of my worst harvests came from trying too hard. Meanwhile, some of the older gardeners around me were using simple methods that cost almost nothing and getting results that seemed impossible. It took me a long time to understand why. That is exactly why I wanted to make this video today. In the next few minutes, I am going to walk you through 7 June mistakes that can quietly reduce your tomato, pepper, and cucumber harvest by 50% or more. More importantly, I will show you the simple fixes that many experienced gardeners use to avoid those problems. Most of them cost little or nothing. A few of them were shown to me many years ago by growers who never seemed to have a bad season. And one particular mistake near the middle of this video is probably hurting more gardens right now than all the others combined. The first mistake is one that almost every gardener makes at least once, and many people keep making it year after year because the plants seem happy at first. I'm talking about giving tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers too much nitrogen in June. This is the month when many gardeners walk through the garden and see plants growing fast. The leaves are getting bigger. The stems are getting thicker. Everything looks green and healthy. So they add more fertilizer thinking even more growth must mean even more harvest. That sounds reasonable until you see what actually happens. The plants become beautiful. They become impressive. They become the kind of plants people stop and admire. But when harvest time arrives, there are fewer tomatoes hanging from the vines, fewer peppers forming on the branches, fewer cucumbers ready for picking. The plant has spent its energy building leaves instead of fruit. I learned this lesson years ago after feeding a row of tomatoes with a strong lawn fertilizer because it was what I had sitting in the shed. Within a few weeks, those plants looked incredible. Dark green leaves, thick stems, huge growth. I thought I had discovered a secret. Then my older neighbor walked over and smiled. He looked at the plants and said they were some of the prettiest tomato bushes he had ever seen. Then he asked where the tomatoes were. That question stayed with me. A few weeks later, I understood exactly what he meant. The harvest was disappointing despite all that growth. Since then, I have followed a much simpler approach. Once tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers are established, I stop chasing leaf growth. Instead, I focus on helping the plant produce flowers and fruit. Most experienced gardeners do the same. They understand that June is the transition month. This is when plants should begin shifting their energy away from building a giant green structure and toward producing the harvest you actually want. Very few people realize how much damage excess nitrogen can cause during this period. The frustrating part is that the mistake looks like success in the beginning. The garden appears healthy while the future harvest is quietly shrinking. And that leads directly to the second mistake because even gardeners who avoid overfeeding often make a watering mistake in June that can create problems just as serious. The second mistake is watering too often but not deeply enough. This one causes more trouble in June than most gardeners realize because the weather is warming up and people naturally start reaching for the hose more frequently. I understand why. You walk outside in the afternoon, the soil surface looks dry, the sun feels hot, the plants seem like they must be thirsty, so you give them a quick spray. Then you do the same thing the next day and the day after that. The problem is that shallow watering teaches roots a bad habit. Instead of growing deeper into the soil where moisture stays available longer, they stay close to the surface waiting for the next drink. Everything seems fine until the first stretch of serious summer heat arrives. Then those shallow roots dry out quickly and the plant begins to struggle. I remember one season when my cucumbers looked fantastic through June. Big leaves, fast growth, plenty of flowers. Then July brought a week of hot weather and production almost stopped. An older gardener asked me a simple question. He asked how long I watered each time. I told him a few minutes almost every evening. He shook his head and explained that I was training my plants to become dependent on daily watering. That conversation changed the way I gardened. Since then, I water less often, but much more deeply. I want the moisture to travel down into the soil where roots can follow it. The difference is remarkable. Tomatoes handle heat better. Peppers stay productive longer. Cucumbers continue setting fruit instead of shutting down when temperatures rise. Another problem with frequent light watering is disease. Wet soil surfaces and damp foliage create conditions that many garden problems love. Most people focus on feeding plants while forgetting that watering habits can either strengthen or weaken them every single day. One of the old methods I still use is checking the soil several inches below the surface before watering. The top layer can look completely dry while there is still plenty of moisture underneath. That simple habit has saved me countless gallons of water and prevented many unnecessary problems. Most gardeners are surprised when they discover they have been watering far more often than their plants actually needed. And while overwatering causes plenty of issues, there is another June mistake that may be even more damaging because it quietly steals flowers before they ever become fruit. That's where many harvests begin disappearing without gardeners realizing it. The third mistake is one that looks completely harmless because gardeners often believe they are helping their plants. It happens when we allow tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers to become overcrowded during June. At first, everything seems wonderful. The plants are growing fast. The garden looks full and lush. Leaves are touching leaves. Vines are spreading everywhere. It feels like more growth must mean more food later. Unfortunately, the opposite is often true. When plants become crowded, they start competing for sunlight and airflow. The outer leaves may look healthy, but deep inside the plant, things begin to change. Moisture lingers longer after watering. Air stops moving freely. Flowers receive less light. Small disease problems suddenly find perfect conditions to spread. Many gardeners do not notice any of this until yellow leaves appear or fruit production slows down. Years ago, I had a row of tomato plants that looked like a green wall. Visitors complimented them constantly. From a distance, they appeared to be the best tomatoes I had ever grown. Then, one morning, I pushed the branches aside and looked inside. The lower leaves were yellowing. Some stems stayed damp long after watering. A few fruits were developing poorly. The plants looked impressive from the outside, but they were struggling where it mattered. That was when an older grower showed me something simple. He said sunlight is not just for the top of the plant. It needs to reach deeper than most people think. Since then, I have never been afraid to remove a few lower leaves from tomatoes or guide cucumber vines so they are not tangled together. With peppers, I make sure each plant has enough space for air to move around it. The change was immediate. Healthier plants, cleaner foliage, better fruit production. And the best part is that it costs absolutely nothing. Many people spend money searching for solutions while ignoring the fact that a pair of garden pruners can solve problems before they start. Very few gardeners realize how much production can be lost simply because flowers and developing fruit are hidden inside dense growth. What makes this even more important is that overcrowding often creates the perfect conditions for the next June mistake. This one is responsible for countless complaints about yellow leaves, weak growth, and disappointing harvests every summer, and most people never connect it to what they are doing right now. The fourth mistake is waiting too long to deal with the first signs of plant stress. June is the month when tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers start telling you exactly how the rest of the season is likely to go. The problem is that most gardeners miss those signals because they are looking for major problems instead of small warnings. A few yellow leaves appear, and people ignore them. Growth slows slightly, and they assume the plant will recover on its own. A handful of cucumber leaves develop spots, and they decide to watch it for another week. Sometimes that works. Very often it does not. One thing I learned after many seasons is that plants whisper before they scream. By the time a serious problem becomes obvious, it has usually been developing for quite a while. I remember a pepper plant that looked almost perfect except for a few lower leaves that had started turning pale. It was easy to ignore because the rest of the plant looked healthy. A week later, more leaves changed color. Then, flower production slowed. By the time I finally investigated the issue properly, the plant had lost valuable growing time. The harvest never fully recovered that season. Since then, I pay close attention to small changes. Not because I worry about every leaf, but because early action is usually simple. A minor nutrient issue is easier to correct than a major deficiency. A few pests are easier to control than an infestation. A small disease problem is far easier to manage before it spreads through the entire garden. One forgotten habit that older gardeners taught me was walking through the garden slowly at least a few times each week. Not watering, not harvesting, just looking. Look under leaves. Look at new growth. Look at flowers. Look at the base of the plants. Most people are surprised how many problems they catch early once they start doing this. And early action almost always means less work later. The interesting thing is that many yellow leaves and weak plants are not caused by disease at all. Quite often, they are connected to something gardeners do with the best intentions. In fact, the next mistake is so common that many people believe it is actually helping their harvest, when in reality, it may be reducing fruit production all summer long. That one catches more gardeners than almost any other mistake on this list. The fifth mistake is letting the first fruits stay on the plant too long. This is especially common with peppers and cucumbers, but it can affect tomatoes too. I understand why people do it. After weeks of waiting, you finally see that first beautiful pepper getting bigger every day, or that first cucumber reaching harvest size. Many gardeners leave it there a little longer because they want it to get even bigger. Then they wait another few days. The problem is that the plant starts receiving a message. As far as it is concerned, its job is already being completed. Seeds are developing. Fruit is maturing. Production can begin slowing down. I learned this lesson from an older gardener who always seemed to carry home buckets of cucumbers while everyone else complained that their vines had stopped producing. One day, I asked him what fertilizer he used. He laughed and said his secret was not fertilizer at all. His secret was harvesting. He walked through the garden almost every day and picked anything that was ready. Small cucumbers never became giant cucumbers. Mature peppers did not sit on the plant for weeks. Tomatoes were harvested as soon as they reached the stage he wanted. The result was simple. The plants kept trying to replace what had been removed. More flowers appeared, more fruit followed. More harvests continued through the season. Most people do the exact opposite. They leave fruit hanging because it looks impressive. A cucumber becomes oversized and full of seeds. A pepper remains on the plant long after it could have been harvested. Meanwhile, the plant slows down and begins directing energy toward finishing existing fruit instead of creating new ones. One forgotten method that many experienced gardeners still follow is regular harvesting, even when they do not immediately need the vegetables. Extra cucumbers can be shared with neighbors. Extra peppers can be frozen. Extra tomatoes can be preserved. The important thing is keeping production moving forward. Very few people realize how much extra harvest can come from simply picking at the right time. And if there is one mistake that might be even more costly than leaving fruit on the plant too long, it is the final mistake on this list. It is responsible for weak growth, poor fruit development, and disappointing yields every year, and many gardeners do not discover it until the season is almost over. The seventh and final mistake is forgetting that June is not just a growing month. It is a root-building month. Most gardeners spend all their time looking at what is happening above the soil, and very little time thinking about what is happening underneath it. Tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers can only produce the harvest their root systems are capable of supporting. If the roots are stressed, compacted, overheated, or constantly disturbed, the plants may survive, but they rarely perform at their best. One of the simplest old methods I learned many years ago was keeping the soil covered. Not with expensive products, just simple mulch. Grass clippings that have dried slightly, straw, shredded leaves, materials that many people already have available for free. A layer of mulch helps the soil stay cooler during hot June afternoons. It slows moisture loss, it reduces weed competition. Most importantly, it creates a more stable environment where roots can keep expanding instead of fighting constant stress. I remember a season when half of my tomato row was mulched and half was not. By midsummer, the difference was impossible to ignore. The mulched plants needed less watering. They stayed healthier during heat waves. Their fruit production lasted longer. That experience convinced me forever. Sometimes the simplest solutions create the biggest results. When you look back at everything we covered today, a pattern starts to appear. Most harvest losses do not come from one dramatic mistake. They come from several small mistakes working together. Too much nitrogen creates excess leaves. Shallow watering weakens roots. Overcrowding reduces airflow. Ignoring early warning signs allows small problems to grow. Delayed harvesting slows production. Bare soil stresses the root zone. Each mistake may seem minor by itself, but together they can easily cut a harvest in half. The good news is that every one of these mistakes can be corrected. None of them require expensive equipment. None of them require special skills. They simply require paying attention to the plants and understanding what they need during this critical part of the season. If you make these adjustments now, your tomatoes can set more fruit. Your peppers can stay productive longer. Your cucumbers can keep producing well into summer. And when harvest season arrives, you may be surprised by how much food those same plants can produce. Because sometimes the difference between an average garden and an outstanding one is not what you add. It is what you stop doing. And there is one forgotten summer habit that many old gardeners still use to push yields even higher. We will talk about that in the next video.